Order. I call the Honourable Mary Ann Street.
Mr. Speaker, listening to that last speaker who has resumed his seat makes me want to spit. Quite frankly, Mr. Heatley had 4 years to start to care about housing affordability, and he didn't. This government has now presented its 5th budget in a row, Mr. Speaker, and this is the first time in 5 budgets they have thought to talk about housing affordability. And why? Because they've been spooked by our policy. Because they've been spooked by the offer of supply. And that minister who has just left the chamber,
Order. The member knows they cannot refer to the absence of members.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It took them a long time to respond to that, didn't it? But the Minister of Housing, as he is now, is so out of touch with housing needs that he doesn't even know about a woman with 5 children living in a garage in his own electorate. And so the reason that woman now has a Housing New Zealand house is because I made a fuss of it and made it a front-page news item. Within a day, she had a state house. Now, that is not about social provision of housing. That's about a minister being embarrassed that he doesn't even know the state of homelessness in his own electorate. And we have the real estate agent from Napier sitting over there saying, people don't buy money. People don't buy houses at the average of the market. The point is, when they're first home buyers and they live in Auckland, they can't even afford the bottom of the market. They can't afford the bottom of the Auckland housing market. If your average is sitting at $735,000, the bottom of the market isn't going to be affordable either. Now, Mr. Speaker, the thing that the Minister and his predecessor have failed to do is to acknowledge, first of all, for the last 5 years, that there is a housing affordability crisis. Mr. Speaker, there was a housing affordability crisis in 2007 when I became the Minister of Housing. Housing affordability was a huge problem because of the inflated expectations and borrowing that people had on the back of the white boys who support the National Party. And we know that that housing bubble collapsed. And we know what the history of that was and the increase in mortgagee sales we've seen since then. But, Mr. Speaker, we brought in a piece of legislation which is much more meaningful than this wishy-washy accord with local bodies that the government is proposing in this legislation. Mr. Speaker, I brought in a piece of legislation that gave local authorities the legal tool in their toolkit to apply pressure to developers to make 10% of any residential development affordable housing in exchange for certain trade-offs, such as waiving development levies. Now, that was a voluntary piece of legislation. It should, according to some arguments, have been compulsory, but in the end it was a voluntary piece of legislation. But it was much better than this piece of nonsense, Mr. Speaker, which says that qualifying developments may be required to include, I can hear them crying, may be required to include affordable housing, or, quote, give consideration to the provision of affordable housing. These people who do not know the reality of most people's lives do not know it. And don't tell me, Mr. Tremaine, that you do. Mr Tremaine, who owns 20 properties, I don't believe that he understands that there is a housing shortage and a housing problem. This has simply come about, this piece of legislation has simply come about because the national government has been spooked by what has turned out to be a very popular policy. Mr Speaker, there are two things. All right, panicked will do. There are two things that are important in housing and addressing housing affordability. They are amongst the things that the members opposite talk about. That's quite right. All of those things are important. But why then did this government, on coming into power in 2008, repeal the legislation that allowed the government, or allowed local bodies to get into conversations with developers and provide affordable housing? Why did they axe that legislation? Why did they axe the shared equity program that would have allowed people to buy their first home by freeing up state-owned, Crown-owned land? By freeing up Crown-owned land, we were offering people the property that stayed in the ownership of the state, and they could buy the house. Over time, as their circumstances improved, as the circumstances improved of that family, they could buy the Crown out. They could buy the Crown out. The program was axed. The program was axed by the government. But I have to say, Mr Speaker, in addition to axing good legislation and good programs, including the Welcome Home Loan program, which saw thousands and thousands of people get into their first homes once the KiwiSaver limit had been reached, and they were able to maximise their contributions and have it matched by government, then they were able to get into their first homes. No, that program was cut as well. But in addition, so not only cutting programs, repealing good constructive legislation, the government then chose also to axe their own program, to axe their Gateway program, which was meant to assist people in affordable homes.
I'm sorry to interrupt the honourable member. Honourable members, the time has come for me to leave the chair for the evening meal. The People's House is suspended, and I shall resume the chair at 7:30 p.m. this evening. Haere rā, ka kite anō. Good evening.